Minister, a presidential election is due to take place in Nicaragua on the 7th of November next. It's obviously a matter for the people of Nicaragua to decide who they want to elect as their president. But if it is the case that that election is taking place without transparency or fairness, it becomes a matter for the international community. And can I ask you whether or not the government has any concerns about the forthcoming election, considering that since last May, over 30 opposition leaders have been arrested by the regime of President Daniel Ortega, and it appears that all opposition in that country is being suppressed?
From passports in Mayo to Nicaragua, but I'm happy to take that question. And I'm deeply concerned by the deteriorating democratic and human rights situation in Nicaragua, in particular the ongoing repression of opposition politicians, members of the media, human rights defenders and civil society representatives. I'm also very concerned at the arrest and detention earlier this year of a number of potential presidential candidates, many of whom are now being prosecuted under the Foreign Agents Law, which contravenes basic democratic principles and seriously undermines the electoral process in Nicaragua. This law, alongside others recently adopted, serve only to tighten restrictions on civil and political rights and fundamental freedoms and hinder the work of civil society and non-governmental organisations in the lead-in to the presidential elections due to be held on the 7th of November. I fully support the statement of the EU High Representative Joseph Borrell on the 10th of June calling for immediate and unconditional release of the detained potential presidential candidates and all other political prisoners, ensuring respect for their human, civil and political rights. Inclusive dialogue is the only way to resolve the political, economic and social crisis in this country. Ireland, through the EU, has consistently called on the Nicaraguan government to abide by its own commitments, by its constitution and by international human rights laws and standards. Ireland is also supportive of the EU's introduction of restrictive measures against targeted individuals in Nicaragua who are responsible for serious human rights violations and/or whose actions undermine democracy and the rule of law. On the 2nd of August, the EU Foreign Affairs Council imposed further restrictive measures on 8 additional individuals, including the Nicaraguan Vice President, which means that a total of 14 persons are now subject to an asset freeze and travel ban. Ireland, along with our EU partners, will continue to support efforts towards reaching a peaceful and negotiated solution in Nicaragua. Officials in my department, including the Embassy of Ireland in Mexico, which covers Nicaragua, will continue to monitor the situation closely in cooperation with the EU delegation.
Thanks very much for that, Prime Minister, and I share your concern. Can I say at the outset that some politicians have the benefit of being viewed as political saints? It's not a designation that applies to myself or to most people in this House, but it is a designation that was applied to Daniel Ortega, who's the current President of Nicaragua. As you'll be aware, he came to power in 1979, he was elected as President in 1984, and he was viewed as the great liberator who brought freedom to Nicaragua and fought against the Contras. That may have been so at that time, but unfortunately now he appears to have turned into a Ceausescu-like dictator. And when you look at some of the measures that have been introduced in Nicaragua recently, I think it's a matter of extreme concern and should be for our government and indeed for the EU. As you mentioned, there have been very many opposition leaders who've been imprisoned. They include journalists and lawyers. It's also the case that a law has been introduced prohibiting anyone who's designated as a traitor from contesting the presidential election. And can I just inquire, Minister, what action further do you think that the EU can take in order to show our opposition to these actions?
Minister to respond.
I think what the EU is doing is using its relatively new human rights laws to formally introduce targeted sanctions against individuals that they believe are responsible for undermining democracy or compromising human rights in the context of international human rights law. And they've already acted on that, which I mentioned earlier, and I think that will remain under consideration within the EU as to whether we extend those targeted sanctions to more individuals. And they are very real sanctions, by the way, in terms of asset freezes, travel bans, and some in Nicaragua will have assets in the European Union. So I think they are targeted sanctions that can be impactful. But as you've outlined,
Thank you,
as we
Minister.
build up to elections at the start of November,
Thank you, Minister. We're over time. I'm sorry. Seachtó O'Connor.
the EU will continue to monitor
Thanks
where
for
we are.
that, response, Minister. I think also it might be worth looking if the department could try to encourage other international human rights bodies to see if they could be authorised to return to Nicaragua. I'm thinking in particular of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. It's obviously a very worrying development if there is this level of oppression going on in Nicaragua at present. Obviously, the election itself on the 7th of November will hopefully be monitored. I'm not aware as to whether or not international election monitors are going to be permitted in, and if they are permitted in, whether they're going to be given the freedom to appraise the election fairly. I suppose, however, you get a message from what has happened in Nicaragua, and that's an example of a revolution that can go wrong. Unfortunately, what we see now is what started out as a revolutionary independence movement has now really transferred into what is a vanity project for President Ortega and his vice president, who also doubles up as his wife, and for the regime of the part of the Sandinista regime. Thank you very much.
1 minute.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is something that the EU has clearly been following and continues to follow. It's not something that's actually got a lot of media coverage here. It's a part of the world, unfortunately, that doesn't get a spotlight often enough. But I think the EU will closely monitor how these elections are run and will maintain a focus on its restrictive measures or targeted sanctions to try and be as persuasive as possible. And of course, there will be an ask from the international community for full access for election observers. Whether that's granted remains to be seen, but I'd have my doubts.